and welcome to our panel on analyzing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. My name is Cliff Ganyard. I'm professor of History, Humanities, and Global Studies here at UW Green Bay, and I'll be your moderator for tonight's discussion. The events of October 7th and the conflict that followed have brought to the fore once more the long-standing conflict between Israel and Palestine. This is a very complicated and difficult conflict with roots back to at least the founding of Israel in 1948 and its frequent conflicts since then with Palestine and a variety of actors in the Middle East. Arguably, the roots go back even further to the Balfour Declaration of 1917, the British Mandate system after the First World War, and perhaps even before that. The events of the past few months have proven particularly divisive, calling forth protests against Israel, protests against Hamas, debates on ceasefires and support for Israel, and rising anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Our panel will seek to address some of these issues and provide some perspective on the conflict. I will introduce each of our speakers in the order that they will speak. Each will have about 10 minutes to talk, and we will have some time at the end for questions and answers and further discussion. Before I do that, though, I'd like to point out that Professor Elise Cohen and research librarian Sarah Bakken have put together a research guide on understanding the Israel-Hamas war, which can be found on the UW Green Bay Library website under Research Guides. So for those of you who are interested in this topic or would like to learn more, I encourage you to go take a look at that research guide and find some of the recommended sources that we've put together. Our panelists tonight are Elise Cohen, Associate Professor of Political Science and Chair of Public and Environmental Affairs, Moises Bahena Martinez, student in Political Science and Public Administration, Hernan Fernandez Miarde, Associate Professor of Spanish and Humanities and Chair of Humanities, Alison Jane Martignano, Assistant Professor of Psychology, and Ryan Martin, Professor of Psychology and Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities and Social Sciences. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Appreciate your participation. Elise, if you'd like to go first.
Thank you so much, Cliff. Can people hear me all right through this mic? I also want to thank all the people that are joining us through the live stream on the YouTube channel. There's a lot of people logged in watching that way, so thank you all for being here to learn. Students in my Politics of Developing Areas course recently watched a talk from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, where she describes the single story problem. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is that not that they are untrue, not only that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story the only story. So I have a few goals and questions tonight that I'm trying to, or hoping that this panel will address. How can we capture some of the diversity and complexity of approaches around this conflict? How can we draw on the knowledge and research that we have here within our college at UW Green Bay to shed light on different ways of thinking about this conflict? And for some political background, I wanted to get us started. Students in my international relations course this week have been reading a series of perspectives from Arab and Israeli analysts, and also hearing a perspective of a Turkish analysis of the conflict. And a lot of those perspectives come to a common point that it's really not surprising for people that have been following this conflict that we have this eruption of violence from October 7 and the current war. With over 2 million Palestinians living in Gaza, they have felt on their end a lack of freedom, a lack of basic human rights, a lack of infrastructure needed to live peacefully in a tiny and densely overcrowded strip of land for many years. Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in 2007, and as punishment for what Israel's government considered a terrorist takeover of the area, it was placed under a tightly controlled monitoring and siege, or some call it blockade, by the Israeli military. Hamas was able to get to that point of taking over the Gaza Strip because the Israeli government had, over the decades, as part of a strategy, weakened the ability for any meaningful opposition to Hamas to be able to rule. There was a more moderate Palestinian Authority governed by Fatah, and this was a threat to the Israeli government. And so the strategy was to prevent any other party from being successful. This backfired because it ultimately enabled Hamas to rise and gain the amount of power that it has today. More recently, Palestinians have felt invisible, as the Israeli government has pursued what's called normalization of diplomatic ties with a number of Arab states and with Turkey in the region. And this hasn't really addressed the root cause of the problem. It hasn't really addressed developing solutions to the conditions that Palestinians are living in. And so Palestinians have even felt that Arab governments in the region and Muslim majority governments are not really caring about their suffering or listening to them. This means year after year, resentment has built up. Many Palestinians feel like nothing has been happening to address their conditions. All the while, the militant wing of Hamas has capitalized on that to try and prove themselves the only viable actor to mobilize meaningful change. They, of course, don't view themselves as terrorists. They view themselves as a form of resistance, as freedom fighters. They have been able to make the argument that nonviolent, peaceful resistance has failed. And so this is all that's left, and that's the case that they are making. For many Israelis, the October 7th attacks were seen through a very different lens. It was seen through the lens of being, quote, the deadliest terrorist attack against the country in its history since its founding in 1948. And this means that we have a really different narrative, right? Coming from many Israelis, they believe that their safety is at stake every single day. They're living in a small, vulnerable country, the only Jewish majority country in the world, the only place where Jewish people arguably could feel safe. They believe military action and violence then could be justified as a form of fighting terrorism to keep their communities safe and to keep their loved ones protected. So we end up with a situation where Israelis and Palestinians, many of whom from both communities, believe the violence is justified. Even if civilians are killed, they believe that this is part of their unique struggle, that they are the true victims of the conflict. As Dr. Ganyard mentioned at the start, historical context absolutely matters for this conflict, and I hope a lot of you will pursue understanding the history. But unfortunately, the points around the facts of this conflict are interpreted very differently. For many Palestinians, the founding of the State of Israel in 1948 is considered to be what's called the Nakba. It's an Arabic word that means catastrophe. It was a violent establishment of a new country, in their view, a response to something that happened far away in Europe, the Holocaust, but which ultimately displaced Palestinian Arabs that were living in the Middle East and had nothing to do with the Holocaust. For many Israelis, the birth of the State of Israel in 1948 was a moment of freedom, celebrated independence, a moment of freedom from anti-Jewish violence and a refuge of safety from the Holocaust, which they call the Shoah in Hebrew. With the sovereign state backed by major powers like the United States, Israelis would go on to develop the most superior military in the region. Never again is a slogan you may have heard. It's a slogan associated with the Holocaust and preventing massacres of Jews from ever happening again. For many Israelis, it's a very special slogan that ties into feeling like any measures to protect Jewish lives are almost always justified, whatever the cost. Again, for many Palestinians, because they feel like they weren't the ones who carried out the Holocaust in Europe, the carving up of the land by Europeans, by the British, in the Middle East lacked full legitimacy. This should have been a shared coexistence piece of land, like it had been for centuries. And they felt cheated by the way the international system and major powers backed the creation of the State of Israel without the creation of a separate sovereign Palestinian state. For many Palestinians, Gaza symbolizes suffering, violation of basic human rights, living in an open-air prison where the world does not really care about you and just uses you as a political pawn. For many Israelis, when watching videos of Israeli hostages being abducted and killed over and over again on loops in news and social media sites every day right now, Gaza is a potential threat to their existence and needs to be kept under close monitoring and full siege as part of fighting terrorism. For many, violence is justified, and Palestinian civilians are often presumed to be terrorists or supporters of terrorists. So what we have is a case where Hamas is seen as a violent villain among many Israelis, and among many Palestinians, the Israeli government and military is seen as the violent villain, or even a terrorist state. So as I wrap up, one of my goals would be to ask, how can these competing narratives be reconciled? How can such different interpretations of what the facts are around this conflict be bridged? Of course, there isn't time to do this justice or address these questions fully here, but I would just offer this concept of intercultural communication to help us. Intercultural communication is intended to help us avoid dehumanizing any of the communities that are suffering as a result of this conflict, to avoid dehumanizing people that are losing their lives, living in fear for the lives and safety of their loved ones. And what that means on our end is that we would need to challenge ourselves to hear different and unfamiliar perspectives, to engage with the perspectives of who we might have been raised to consider the stranger or the enemy, and to try and seek out knowledge and education from how they may be viewing the conflict. Intercultural communication, to me, is also important because it helps us realize there are multiple competing interpretations for this conflict. It's really not a two-sides conflict of Israelis versus Palestinians. It's more like 7 sides, right? There are those that support a two-state solution. There are those that support a one-state solution. There are those that support violence as a form of resistance, and there are those that think violence is always unacceptable no matter what the situation, and there will be no security without peace. There are those that really aren't interested in conflict resolution or compromise and just want to use the conflict for domestic political gains or gains within the region. And so we need to remember that Israelis are very divided as citizens over this conflict, and that many Palestinians had very low support for Hamas before these attacks. And now, if there's some increase in support for Hamas, it's also out of desperation often because there are no other actors that are really offering solutions to move things forward. Finally, I would just say another thing to remember is that Israel, 20% of the population is what they call Israeli Arabs, many of whom are Palestinian citizens of Israel, and also Druze, who are citizens of Israel, and they have a unique perspective as well. They are very against Hamas, and they feel some solidarity with the state of Israel, but also feel like there's a lot of discrimination and almost an apartheid situation within Israel. So I hope just listing those out, you've probably counted around 7 different perspectives that you could take of the conflict, rather than just Israelis versus Palestinians. And now I will turn things over to Moises, my excellent student.
Greetings, everyone. International relations can be seen through three different lenses. The international system, which includes the international organizations that currently, quote unquote, govern our world. It can also be seen from the state perspective, meaning what do individual states, another word for country, does with each other, how they perceive each other, and what would they believe is the best course of action to relate with each other. And finally, it can also be seen from an individual perspective, which is how individuals, us, can affect the governments the governments of each state, and how we can pressure the international system to act. I'll begin with an individual perspective. From what I've seen in my 2 months of analysis in Israel and Palestine, is that the people have a lack of trust for each other. They both believe that each other started the war. They felt betrayed. For example, Palestine felt betrayed because back prior to the end of World War I, there was a promise made by Great Britain that they would create a single united Arab nation. However, that was not the case. And instead, the Great Britain and other powers back in its time decided to prioritize Zionist movements for the creation of the State of Israel. Now, with that said, they both also believe that that land is only for them. They do not believe each other have the right to stay there, and that they should either get out of the Levant, which is Israel and Palestine. This has created hostile relations between each other, individuals that do not see clear empathy for what the other sees, for what the other claims, and their respects. This has led to ultra-religious movements and ultra-nationalist movements where they also see that they want to support a state where the land is only for them. This has created a national interest of, once again, a two-state solution, a one-state solution, and a multitude of others that I cannot mention because there are many. Because of that, we have to see again from an international relations perspective. People all over the world have claimed that they need to, my apologies, that the states have to other states have to intervene in this situation, in Israel and Palestine. For us, the United States, a lot of people have protested back in Washington, in New York, and even here in Green Bay, that the United States should intervene in the Palestinian conflict by retrieving or getting rid of aid to the state of Israel. Apart from that, one of many of the reasons why they should retrieve trade, according to them, is because they believe it's like the United States, it's sponsoring human rights violations. For example, Article 7, Section 1, F of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court is claimed that has been violated by Israel by torturing captured civilians, not just after the attacks on October 7th, but also prior on quote-unquote raids in not just Gaza, but also on the West Bank. Another claim is that another human right that has been violated is apartheid. Unfortunately, movement for Palestinians is very restricted among the between Gaza and the West Bank. They need they're divided by we can say a passport system where, depending on the kind of passport a person has. For instance, if someone has a Gaza passport, they can only travel within Gaza and really limited to almost none to the West Bank and other parts of the world. Another thing is the various checkpoints where Israelis only need just to quickly present their one identification card or their passport, and they can go freely across the country. Whereas Palestinians need more than just that. More than just passports, they also need to verify the status, criminal records, and a lot of more things. Now, for the government, the international government organization that has been looked upon with most emphasis is the International Criminal Court, and people all over the world, and states alike, demand that the ICC takes action and create warrants against leaders in Israel as well as in Hamas, so they can be brought to justice for their actions. However, the ICC doesn't have a police force that can actually enforce their decisions. They have to rely on the states or countries. However, as we have seen, many nations, including the United States, are reluctant to engage either by a national interest in having an ally in the region, or because of partisan decisions they have made that could potentially support their next election. And thus, the ICC is really limited in how they can actually act to the situation that is currently unfolding in the land. So, to conclude my part of this of the panel, my part, the change cannot just occur at the international level. It also has to happen within us. If we do not pressure leaders at the state level, meaning the government, to act a certain way, then the gridlock that we're experiencing all over the nation and also the world will keep going on. So the best course of action, in my opinion, will be to seek empathy with each other, listen to what everyone has to say, and collaborate to create a compromise that everyone can be grateful and accept. Thank you. That's the section. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I would like to start this presentation with some facts and a couple of definitions. By the end of the Second World War, the population of Palestine was about 750,000 people, 94% Muslims, 6% Jewish. It seems a little not in order, but you're gonna get at the end. Tel Aviv, the capital of the state of Israel, was founded in 1909 by a group of Jewish in a land purchased by Jacob Kahn, a Dutch citizen, who registered them in his name to circumvent the Turkish prohibition on Jewish land acquisition. Currently, almost half of Israeli population lives in the Tel Aviv metropolitan area. The modern Hebrew is the official language of the State of Israel, which is also the only successful instance of a complete language revival, since the Hebrew wasn't spoken anymore since the 3rd century BCE, after what it was only used for Jewish liturgy, literature, and written correspondence. By the late of 19th century, a Russian Jewish linguist Eliezer ben Yehuda began a movement to revive Hebrew as a living language, motivated by the desire to preserve Hebrew as a mother tongue to Jewish nationality in the context of the Zionism. Currently, Hebrew is spoken by 10 million people. There are three main groups, diasporas from Jewish: Ashkenazi, who traditionally spoke Yiddish, which is a kind of ancient German; Sephardic, who mostly spoke Ladino, which is a kind of ancient Spanish; and Mizrahi, sorry my pronunciation, Mizrahi, which is mostly a derivative of Sephardic, but who spoke the language of the country where they live, mostly Arabic and Persian. The last Jewish group accepted in the state of Israel was the Ethiopian Jewish, Beta Israel, in 1975. The NAPCA that Alice talked a little bit means the catastrophe, was the displacement and dispossession of Palestinians, along with the destruction of their society, culture, identity, political right, and national aspiration during 1948 Palestine war, as well as the ongoing persecution and displacement of Palestinians by Israel through the Palestinian territory. During the foundational event of the NAPCA in 1948, dozens of massacres targeting Muslims were conducted, and over than 500 Muslim towns and villages were depopulated, with many of them being either completely destroyed and repopulated by Jewish residents and given new Hebrew names. Approximately half of Palestine's predominantly Muslim population, 750,000 people, fled from their home or were expelled by Zionist militias and later by Israel army, in what is now the state of Israel. As a whole, the NAPCA covers the long-standing rejection of the Palestinian right to return, the recreation of permanent Palestinian refugees, and the shattering of Palestinian society for the establishment of the Jewish state. The number of registered Palestinian refugees has grown from 50,000 in 1950 to around 5 million in 2013. This population since live in a state of exception. which means a situation in which common law and legal guarantees are suspended. As developed by, this is the definition, as developed by Deleuze and Guattari, deterritorialization is a process by which social relation, called a territory, has its current organization and context altered, mutated, or destroyed. The component then constitute a new territory, which is the process of reterritorialization. The idea has been applied to describe the shifting of social, culture, economic, and political practices, as well as of people, object, language, tradition, or beliefs in relation of their respective originating bodies. Some theorists have adopted a literary understanding of the word, applying it to geographical territories and their respective relations. We can describe under this system the invasion of Palestine by Jewish, in which Jewish deterritorialized the Palestinian land by eliminating their symbol of the Muslims' cultures and beliefs. Then Jewish reterritorialized this region by putting up their own culture, system, and ideology. With his form of hegemonic control, the appropriation of the territory was established. In this territory, the Jews developed what Antonio Gramsci conceptualized as a hegemonic culture, which is a set of values and norms that must become common sense values for everyone. The people of the State of Israel consequently identify their own good with the good of the State of Israel and help it to accept and maintain this new ideology that must be accepted as an essential condition for living in the State of Israel. Facing the obvious military inferiority, in recent decades, the resistance of Palestinian people has become a crucial reaction in the struggle to defend their sovereignty over the occupied and non-occupied territories. The Palestinians were a subaltern resistance against Israeli domination by producing anti-hegemonic discourses that denounce the marginalization of Palestinian people and the extreme violence with which Israel maintains the peace inside its territory. Terrorism is part of this resistance. Thank you.
Hello. I first want to start by thanking my fellow panelists. I am not an expert in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at all, and I've learned so much from you already, so thank you for that. I am, however, an expert in empathy. So I'm a psychologist, and my research is on the concept of empathy, the situations which produce empathy, the people for which we are more likely to have empathy for, and possibly most importantly for this talk, the ways in which we can increase our empathic capacity. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, is how we can potentially become more empathic. And on that front, I have good news and bad news. Before I can get into that, I first need to give you some definitions. Because empathy is one of those words that we all think we know what it means, but actually if you ask different people, they have different ideas about what it means. In psychology, we make a distinction between two types of empathy. We call them emotional empathy and cognitive empathy. So emotional empathy is, you can think of that as like empathy with your heart. This is feeling for another people. Maybe that person's feeling sad, so you feel sad. Or maybe that person's angry, so you feel angry as well. Any kind of emotional reaction would come under that umbrella of emotional empathy. On the other hand, we have cognitive empathy, which you can think of as more empathy with your mind. This is thinking about what other people are going through, imagining their perspectives, taking their point of view. You don't necessarily have to have an emotional reaction in order to sort of cognitively understand someone else's point of view. So I want to make that important distinction Because when it comes to having empathy for people who are different from us, people from another group, people that we may perceive as the enemy, this distinction is really important. That emotional type of empathy is biased, basically. We don't have that natural emotional response for people who we've in our mind grouped as the other or the enemy. There's some fascinating neuroscientific research that looks at people in a brain scanner or measures their skin conductance or their heart rate, and we just don't have the same physical reaction, the same emotional reaction when we see the suffering of somebody who we consider the other, as opposed to when we see the suffering of somebody we consider as part of our group. So if we're wondering why perhaps there doesn't seem to be enough empathy for the suffering of civilians and children during this war, it may be because of a lack of that emotional empathy. We just don't feel it for them. So that's the bad news part. The good news, though, comes from the other part of empathy, that more cognitive empathy, that empathy we have with our mind, because that's more consciously controlled. That we can actually make a deliberate decision to engage in. Now, sure, we might decide not to because we can't be bothered or we don't care about that group, but we can choose to. We can choose to put effort into consciously imagining what somebody else is going through. So there is the possibility to empathize with others who we don't consider to be part of our group. My research actually focuses on that cognitive type of empathy and how to improve it. And what most of my research and some esteemed colleagues' research shows is that it's kind of like a muscle. It improves with exercise, with practice, so we can essentially get better at empathizing in this way. But it, much like a muscle, takes hard work. This is not an easy thing to do. We have to really put effort into trying to imagine other people's perspectives. And we might get it wrong at first, and then we need to try again. And so, much like a muscle, no pain, no gain. You've got to put that effort in. There are many different opportunities and times where we can practice our empathy skills. So one of the hardest times to empathize is when we're trying to take the perspective of somebody who we consider to be different to us, or who we consider to be an enemy. That's really hard to do. And so actually, I would advocate that we need to start with little baby steps, that we need to get better at empathy first with something that's perhaps not quite so challenging. And so my research actually looks at cultivating empathy in more low-stakes situations. In fact, actually sometimes fictional situations. So you can imagine, for example, reading a story, perhaps a novel or a fictional narrative of a Gazan child, for example. And you could imagine how this character is thinking, feeling, what they're going through, their motives, for example. And even though it's fictional, you are actually exercising and practicing your empathy muscles in trying to understand that fictional story. And so stories and art is often a great opportunity to practice empathy in a low-stakes situation. So that's one place that we can start. But this is no small problem. And I don't want to be the person who's like, empathy is going to solve everything, because I think that's an oversimplification here. And when we start to talk about empathizing for people who are different from us, trying to take their perspective, it's harder. It gets harder and harder when you think somebody is your enemy or completely different from you. It becomes very difficult to take their perspective. So I want to give some sort of tips from the psychological research on how to begin that difficult process. And it starts with what I'm going to call high-quality listening. So we all know how to listen, and we've probably been told that, we should nod along and reflect back. But the research on how to listen well focuses on understanding what the other person is saying as first step. And this is particularly important when talking to somebody else who has a different point of view. In fact, the research on this is really fascinating, because if you are listening to someone else who disagrees with you, and as a very first step you say, so what I hear you saying is, and you sort of paraphrase what they're saying, that almost immediately changes the tone of the conversation. It makes that person more likely to listen to what you say next. It brings you closer, it bonds you closer, it increases compassion. And it actually increases the likelihood that they might change their mind. Because you've shown where you're coming, that you understand where they're coming from before you offer your counterpoint. So it's really important to first understand where they're coming from, reflect on that, and then offer your counterpoint. So that would be my first step that I would offer when trying to practice empathizing to people who we see as really different from ourselves. It is a hard skill. It is difficult to learn. We're going to slip up on the process of learning how to do this, but I would encourage baby steps, starting practicing empathizing and high quality listening. Thank you.
Hey everybody. So I want to, I guess, also thank my panelists for this. I am also not an expert on the conflict, but and so I very much value the information I'm getting tonight, as well as the library guide that I learned about. And it actually nicely connects to a lot of the things that I want to talk about today. So I'm an emotion researcher, and I was asked tonight to talk a little bit about managing emotions to hear and engage different perspectives. And so it's very similar to what Alice and Jane was talking about. But what I think, to get there, what I want to do is kind of highlight three particular points that I would encourage people to consider. And they're going to, I think, very nicely connect to a lot of what other people have said tonight. But the first is to make sure that what you are responding to is real. And I'm going to come back to all of these. But to start there, to make sure that you're operating off accurate information. The second is to consider multiple perspectives, which I think is what Alice and Jane, or part of what Alice and Jane is saying. But I'm going to also talk about how to better understand how your emotions actually get in the way of that. So things that you might be feeling that interfere in your ability to hear and listen to other people and understand their perspective. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about how to channel those emotions into action. And how we can actually, I think a lot of times when people hear that I'm an emotion researcher and that I'm talking about managing emotions, they think I mean like staying calm or staying like collected. And I mean, that's important, but what I actually care about more than that is how to perceive and understand and manage, but also to use your emotions. Like, so how do you take that anger that you might be experiencing and do something with it? And so to highlight that first part, so make sure what you're responding to is real. This is actually rooted in an information literacy question, right? There is a great deal of inaccurate information, not just about, I mean, this is true of any news story. There's a great deal of misinformation present on social media and in the news and elsewhere. And it's not just that information drives negative emotions or could drive negative emotions. It's that oftentimes it's intentional and strategic and manipulative, that there is a very real and ultimately dishonest attempt to manipulate our emotions. And we have to be aware of that. We have to recognize that very real threat because, I mean, it exists for a couple reasons. One is people on a particular side wanting people to agree with them, and so sharing the information that way. But also because the research would tell us that basically things that make you angry are far more likely to go viral, far more likely to spread than things that don't provide that emotional balance, right? So you're more likely to share something if it makes you mad. And if their interest is in getting you to share things, well, then that's what they're going to do. So we have to be aware of that, and that requires, frankly, it requires the work like you're doing here tonight to learn more about this. It requires going to the library guide that Elise mentioned earlier. It requires doing homework to make sure that what you're operating off of is accurate. A second piece here is the considering multiple perspectives, but I want to talk about, because I think Elise really nicely did that, but I want to talk a little bit about what gets in the way when we do that. And it is actually another emotion, something we don't necessarily think of as an emotion sometimes, but defensiveness. That considering other perspectives requires us to be able to let down our guard a little bit and to be intentional about that. And so one of the So defensiveness can literally be thought of as an emotional response to some piece of information that we perceive to be a threat. And it is exacerbated, or it's harder for us, or we get more defensive, I guess, if that piece of information is, we perceive it essentially as threatening to something deeply personal about us, right? So something that is core to our identity, something that is core to kind of who we are, right? So if you all came up to me afterwards and said, hey, Ryan, you're really bad at fishing, I wouldn't care. I don't think of myself as a fisher person. I would just, say, well, I don't know how you know that. That's weird, but okay. Now, if you said to me, Ryan, you're not a very good public speaker, or you're a really bad teacher, that would hurt, right? I'd get defensive about that because that's how I identify. I think of myself as someone who cares about those things, who wants to be good at those things, and those things matter. And the same is true with any information we take in. That if there is a cause that is deeply personal to you, and a person shares information with you that runs contrary to your belief system, it hurts. And it hurts in a way that makes you want to reject that information. So one of the things we have to do is be very aware of that and very intentional about letting down those guards and letting down and being able to say, to literally tell ourselves in the moment, even though this thing, it runs contrary, I have an obligation to investigate it, right? I have an obligation to unpack this piece of information and decide what it means and so on. And that I think is particularly important when it comes to the considering multiple perspectives, thinking about things from another person's point of view. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the channeling emotions into action. We oftentimes think of anger in particular. So I study emotions, but I study anger more than any other emotion. And one of the things we know is that people long time have used this like pressure cooker metaphor for anger, thinking of anger as, and this is rooted in I think Plato, right? So pretty old. Freud is sort of the modern psychologist who popularized it, but it's an old concept. And it's inaccurate, right? That's not how anger works, but the belief is that, hey, if we just release a little bit of steam, we won't blow up, and we just got to keep releasing it in various ways. And I don't see anger that way, and I don't think that's a very good, healthy, accurate metaphor for it. What I do think, though, and maybe this is connected to that metaphor a little bit, is that I think you can think of anger and all emotions as fuel, that they are there to energize us. When we get angry, or when we get scared, or when we even get sad, part of what that's doing is activating our physiological state to energize us to do something, to act in some way. And like any fuel, it's combustible, right? We can act in an unhealthy way. We can get angry and blow up in a way that is harmful to ourselves, harmful to our loved ones, harmful to other people. Or we can channel that fuel into something productive. And I think this really connects to some other things that have been said today about the need to, part of why this is so important is that when you are feeling emotionally overwhelmed, when you are feeling sad, when you are feeling a lot of things, it's because on some level you're feeling potentially helpless and hopeless. And a way to get that back is by engaging in some sort of action, no matter how small it is, to try and solve whatever problem is in front of you. And so a way to do that is to think about how you can channel those emotions you're feeling into that positive action, even if it's making a small change moving forward. That's it. I think you're next, right?
So to wrap things up, I guess, a
Yes.
little bit. So first off, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for those wonderful comments and thoughts about the Israeli-Hamas war and relationships between Israel and Palestine. We've got some time, almost about half an hour for questions and answers and some discussion. And I would ask that if you have questions, that you please come up to one of the microphones so that the people online can hear your question and respond. But I wonder if I might start things off, if that's all right. And I want to ask a kind of twofold question of the panelists, so any of you can respond to this. But I wanted two things struck me from all of your discussions. First, a number of you pointed out a lot of the difficulties that reach way back into history, 1948, 1917, 1909, and even before that to Theodor Herzl and Zionism, and that there are these very long-term difficulties and conflicts and barriers between finding solutions and ways forward. But all of you also responded in trying to find solutions, and many of those solutions, it struck me, were very personal. So we heard about intercultural communication. Moises talked about having to change ourselves. We heard a lot about empathy from both Allison Jane and Moises. Ryan has given us some good advice on trying to think about misinformation and responding appropriately to these things. And so the twofold question then is, given all of that a lot of the panel has been directed at us as individuals, changing ourselves. I wonder if some of you could respond to the question of what is the significance for the Israel-Hamas war to us as Americans, right? Why should we be concerned about this? And then with that in mind, what can we do to try and make a change going forward, either in ourselves or with our friends and family around us, or even more significantly with our government, with our society? So I'm curious if any of you have any thoughts or responses to those points.
Thank you, Cliff. I'll get us started and then pass along the mic. Yes, what is the significance to us if we are Americans? So the U.S. is the #1 supporter of the Israeli military. Roughly $3.8 billion per year in foreign aid flows from the U.S. government to Israel. So if you are a U.S. citizen, automatically, you have a significant connection to what is happening every day in the conflict, because your taxpayer dollars, so to speak, even though I'm not a big fan of metaphors and analogies of your taxpayer dollars, but if you're going to go that route, directly fuels the violence and the conflict. Now, a lot of that is joint missile defense programs and weapons purchases from U.S. contractors that go back into the U.S. economy. But the weapons are being used for a certain purpose. So how you feel about that purpose and how you feel about what's happening in the conflict is really a crucial stake in our own government's decisions about the foreign relations with the Israeli military. And then the second reason I would say that it's really significant to us as Americans is because I think I study the discourse of elected officials and policymakers, and it doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat or conservative or liberal. Americans have this sense that we believe in freedom and democracy and human rights, and almost like an exceptionalism, that part of American identity is this providential exceptionalism, like a beacon of hope. So maybe younger generations are more skeptical of the beacon of hope vision of what America means, but I think that's still there, whatever the age group is. And so how does that translate in the conflict? How do you feel like freedom and liberty and human rights and this idea of being a beacon of hope, how is that playing out in this conflict? So that's what I would say. Moises, do you have some ideas?
Yeah, actually. Okay. For us, the United States, it is very significant because, as previously stated, we are seen as a beacon of hope, of human rights that we distribute throughout the world. However, as I believe many of you know, there was previously a resolution back in the United Nations where the Security Council was deciding whether to stop this conflict that started since the military conflict that started since October 7th. And unfortunately, and the United States voted against. And David Satterfield, the Biden administration Middle East envoy for human issues, said this. Okay. Okay, it got deleted. But basically, it was stated that the reason why we cannot just simply stop the conflict was because Hamas would get an advantage to recover and potentially strike again back at Israel. Because of this, many countries have seen the United States as a little bit hypocritical in that sense. Since, well, we decide not to intervene when it's Israel and Palestine, but we do decide to intervene when it's Ukraine and Russia. And because of that, many other nations, potentially either in Asia, but even Europe, Latin America, just stop believing that the United States should carry on with its role as being some sort of promoter of human rights and decide to just go their own ways. That could potentially harm us in the sense that maybe let's say there was a human rights issue in another country, and those nations might not start taking the United States seriously. Then what then? Even if we decide to intervene, like militarily, other nations might oppose because they would believe we're intervening on accordance to our own interests rather than actually sponsoring human rights. Now, that said, the other question was, how do we create this change? To create a change, as I stated in my solution, was to take a step back from what we already believe and start actively listening to each other. By listening to other perspectives, we can find gaps also in our own statements and arguments, where we can fill it in with other people's arguments and potentially even reach a compromise. Of course, not all of our demands from our side will be met. Like people who say that we should support Israel, support Palestine. We all know that our demands for either side are not going to be met, so we just have to compromise and select a few so we can actually progress in baby steps. When we're finished with a step, then we can progress to another one and gradually start solving the problem. We cannot just simply create a change immediately. We have to progress through that. That's all I have to say.
Great answer.
Could I also jump in?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so full disclosure, I'm not American. I'm actually British. So my home country was a large cause of this problem, if I remember my history correctly. But I like this idea that you're talking about as America as a beacon of hope, and I wanted to just tweak that a little bit to the young people in America being the beacon of hope. So I wanted to refer to a very famous piece of empathy research, if you follow that empathy has been declining for generations. This was it made most of the headlines in most of the major newspapers. That study was actually done by my PhD advisor, Sarah Conrad. And you might be very interested to know that only a few months ago she published an update. It's actually been rising since 2008 amongst American young people. 2008 was the lowest point. American undergraduates who went to school in 2008, which is actually when I went to school, had the lowest levels of empathy. And it's actually been going up since then. Both types of empathy, actually, that cognitive type with your mind and the empathy, the emotional with your heart. So I would say that I was talking about how to cultivate empathy as an individual. But it's really wonderful to see that it's actually a group of people seem to be rising. Young Americans seem to be becoming more empathic. And so I do think of them as a beacon of hope.
Just a word. Also, I'm not American. But in the Constitution of the United States, it says that this country have the task to protect the freedom, democracy around of the world. it's in the Constitution. And then it's curious because international politics in America have a very bad reputation around of the world. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, etc. And that's for us it's incredible because the common sense in America, people don't know very well how works international politics in America. When I teach classes from Latin America, almost in the first class, nobody knows that United States have an intervention in every single country in Latin America. In all coup d'etat and dictatorship allies to United States. So, and I don't want to say what the amount of money that mentioned Alice, that we need here in the university and the education, American education, that is ridiculous amount of money. How people in Washington do and convince the voters and taxpayers to send that amount of money for somebody that I don't care. I don't care about Ukraine. Okay, I care about people die, but how change in America if Ukraine, I don't know, it's their things, but I don't want to say that I approve Russia invasion, no. But I don't approve any weapon, any conflict, any war. But what is the concern of America about that? Okay, I know, the peace, freedom, etc. But what is the change? This amount of money, that's probably who win this war? The weapon factory, and nobody else. So I think to come back to your question, say, okay, I don't know if most voters in America are aware of what is happening in Palestine, and what is the daily day of Palestine and Israeli people there, and where goes this amount of money when we send it to Israel,
Now let's jump to the
So my name's Jacob Beckel. I'm co-chair of the SDS chapter here on campus, and I'd like to open this and say, you four are goddamn cowards. Essentially, I'm going to go through each of your arguments one by one. You call for a compromise between the two. It is not the Palestinians who are currently being genocided in the Gaza Strip who need to call for compromise. It is the Zionists currently in charge of Israel who need to compromise and finally stop with this genocide and follow ceasefire. And even then, ceasefire is not a solution that will last in this part. The only solution that will, I'm personally a one-state solution advocator, but that's not to be discussed here. That's outside the scope of this conversation. And especially with the person here on the far left calling for gradual change, it doesn't matter if the change is gradual when people die every day, when people's lives are lost every day, not only with a military invasion and genocide in Gaza, but also people have been suffering every day before this with the illegal settlements in the West Bank, with the food blockades, with multiple humanitarian groups not being allowed to do work within Palestine. Additionally, on top of that, people around the world who support Palestine have been dying there. Famously, American and British activists have been killed by Israeli attacks simply because the Israeli government knows no matter what they do, their genocide will be supported by the West. The West has vested interest to keep Israel alive as an imperialist base in the Middle East. And with your argument on empathy, there is no world for empathy with a fascistic genocider. That is out of the question until said fascistic government is no longer in power. would you go up to a Holocaust survivor and say, hey, listen, I know the German government did many things against people that were illegal and wrong, but you gotta understand, these Germans felt threatened by your existence. No, you wouldn't say that. You wouldn't say that under any circumstance. That's wrong to ask of them. Now, there are children who didn't live through that. Sure, you can ask them to maybe feel a little bit of empathy. But personal survivors of a genocide, you do not expect this level of morality from. You would not ask them of this morality. And with your argument about, oh, well, we just need emotional control to like work through this, it went for decades. If people are going through an oppressive regime, an oppressive genocide, what do you want them to do? You want them, like when they've exhausted every political option, you want them to be like, oh, well, we've done everything we can with the Israeli government. We should just keep trying over and over again. No, they need to do something to stop the murder. The only person here who I genuinely respect the thoughts and opinions of in this panel currently is Hernan, because he has not been using much subtext, because even if you all four of you are pro-Palestinian, in all of your talks, you have not been discussing this in any way. You've been using cowardice subtext to say that you agree with the Palestinians' plight, but you have not been condemning them in any real way, condemning the Israeli government in any real way.
Thank you, Jacob. So some pretty strong feelings and opinions there. Would anyone like to respond or offer comments?
Yeah, I'll get started. Yes, thank you, Jacob. I think it's just really important to hear these arguments and ideas because, again, Hamas has been able to build some support with the notion that nonviolent, peaceful resistance has been tried by Palestinians for decades. And what has it got them? And I think what we're hearing in Jacob's points, even though I definitely wouldn't call my co-panelists cowards, but I understand where that's coming from because that is how many Palestinians living in Gaza feel like no one is actually willing to do anything. No one is actually willing to pressure their governments to stop the bombardments or stop the airstrikes and save them. So I think it does connect with what Dr. Martin was saying about sometimes anger can be a good thing because I don't know you personally, but I have a sense that you're probably very motivated to make change. You're probably very motivated to be an activist and get people to vote and get people to pressure their lawmakers. And I think that that's an important thing. So again, I understand you were not happy with some of us, and I just want to say I respect that and I get it, and I think that it's just important to hear these arguments because this is also why Hamas has been able to build support because it's well, nobody's actually doing anything, they're just talking, right? So where's the action? So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I'm actually worried you didn't quite hear some of what was said tonight. So that's the opposite, I think, of what I hear you saying that you're very angry, but I don't actually, I'll just take my points. I think I literally said that people should use their anger as fuel to motivate change. That wasn't intended to mean that we shouldn't use our anger. I was trying to say the opposite. So I guess I'm perplexed by that side of things. Yeah, I guess I don't know necessarily what else to say. I'm glad you're angry. I think it makes sense that you should be. I think that was my point.
Okay. I'd actually like to offer just a personal response. I am an empathy researcher. That's what I'm an expert in. I think I mentioned I'm not an Israeli-Palestinian researcher. That is not my area of expertise. And I would feel I was going outside of my expertise to make any comment, and which is why I haven't, because I don't feel that's my place. I'd love to talk to you when I'm not in my role as a professor of empathy, where I feel that I need to stay in my box, because we can talk about our own personal views, but I've accepted the position on this panel to share my research about empathy, so that's why I stuck to.
Just to add on to that, so you don't feel like a genocide people group matters to you at all?
No, I don't. I'm a person with opinions, and I frequently teach as a professor and focus on the data and focus on my expertise. And I work really hard to separate those two.
All right. Before I answer your question, well, I understand you first, but let me just clarify. I made a mistake here. It was not David Satterfield who said what I said. It was Robert Wood. Robert Wood, Deputy U.S. Ambassador to the UN. Just clarify that. And yes, I also agree that, on your stance that unfortunately Israel has been committing some abominable actions in Palestine, and they should be definitely condemned. However, if we decide to just take a side on our action, just to take a side, then what if the other side starts saying like something like, oh, it's Palestine was the one who started because they refused to at least give us some land, or they are part of a historic land, and we just come to each other in an aggressive way. Now, when I said about a compromise and a gradual progress, I didn't mean just to simply neglect such as the things of food blockages or the suffering that's conducted every day. And however, I can also see that what if, in part of our gradual process, we begin specifically with those subjects such as food blockades and aid blockades. What if we also, so what I'm trying to say here is that when how can I say it? Oh yes, when I decide, when we reach a compromise, we can begin with that immediately, with the food blockades, the air blockades, the restrictions on traveling. We can immediately begin on that, and then from there we can progress as together. Because if I see your point, however, if we decide to go like that, what if just the Israeli government decides just to ignore us at all? We have seen that right now, that not even the United States, like warnings or anything like that even worked. I understand your point. I'm just saying progress slowly, but starting with those points you'd mentioned.
Hi, my name is Leo Repke. I'm just a student here at UWGB. I don't really have any ties to associations at the moment. But I've got a few questions, but the first one's going to start right here at UWGB. Is UWGB research considering the first-hand sources on social media coming out of Palestine, displaying many videos of fear, starvation, death, including a man who was, when asked why he was carrying 2 plastic bags of body parts, replied that it was all he had left of his children?
I didn't understand the question. I understood the comment. Is UWGB doing what?
Considering the thousands of videos that are coming out of Palestine through TikTok and Instagram, because it's the only source of communication they have left, are we considering that in our research of this conflict, of this genocide?
Yeah, I'll take that. So I co-authored an article on civilian casualty inequity a few years ago. And because for those of you that are following this conflict, you may know there's this huge gap, there's this huge asymmetry in the death toll where, obviously October 7th was this terrorist attack that was the deadliest terrorist attack for Israelis with 1,200 killed and 250 plus hostages. But then when we look at the death toll since then of the invasion, we're getting close to almost 30,000 Palestinians killed. And that's not new, because this co-authored article is like almost a decade ago or something. That has been decades of the trend where there's way more civilian lives lost among Palestinians. So what's interesting is before we were in the social media age, the narrative in the US was very one-sided. It was very much only seeing more like the Israeli suffering, even something like the New York Times, which is considered a liberal kind of leaning source today, I would say. It used to be considered more mainstream, and it was like only the aftermath of the terrorist attack of Israeli suffering. What really wasn't that footage that the questioners mentioning or the commenters mentioning coming like directly you can see. And I think it really has changed. The survey I was looking at when I came in, which would have impacted the research on this conflict, it showed that for the first time we are really seeing Americans questioning, like, I'm not sure that the Biden administration is doing the right thing. It used to be much more solidly just pro-Israel, and this is the first time, and with younger generations, that it's actually like, no, we're seeing these images of suffering, and we're hearing, like, the New York Times, again, pretty mainstream but liberal, is hearing perspectives straight out of Palestinians trapped in Gaza, having to move, 5, 6 times, having no water, no way to go to the bathroom, and they're sharing their perspectives, and you can hear them. You can hear the interview. You can hear the fear in their voice. So I do think it really is changing, and for researchers that study the conflict, that's like a whole different landscape now, because Americans just didn't even understand what the civilian casualty inequity looked like, of how much skewed it was for the Palestinian suffering, and I think it's really starting to come in the survey data and in the pressure among younger people. The problem is, as Dr. Weinschenk, I think, is here, could probably tell you if you took an American politics class with him, the youth voter turnout is the smallest of all the voter turnout in the US elections. And so US officials and people running for office, they're just not really primed to care as much what younger generations think, because they think like you're not going to vote. And that's where I think the change can be, is if they really see like there's this resistance coming, and it is having a voice of anger towards the current status quo, that then they would sort of say, oh, is it enough that it could really shape an election? And then they would really hear that. So I guess a plug for voter turnout, if you're passionate about the issue, and for understanding that it is changing. Like, you are seeing out of the social media videos things that 10 years ago just most Americans weren't aware of.
I do have to argue that many of the government officials in our government today, I don't know why I said it like that, are being funded and lobbied by a group called AIPAC, which is the American Israeli Public
Affairs Committee.
Affairs Committee. Yep, that's it. And the fact that we have all of these rallies, we have stopped traffic in LA was it LA? It was LA or New York, on many bridges multiple times. We have shown turnouts thousands of times for just a ceasefire. That's all US voters have been asking. And these government officials can't seem to care, because this money is talking much louder than they are. So I think no matter what the American voter turnout is, we have to bring this down to its source and show that there is an actual threat versus just letting the money blind them.
I think the public opinion is changing, but not the government. Because in international politics, America doesn't change when the party change, and the government. Nothing changed when Obama took the office after Bush. Doesn't change. And you say, okay, in the internal politics, yes, a lot, but international politics doesn't change. So the only thing that's gonna change is to change the public opinion.
But is it not the Biden administration who is putting out the U.S. representative that is going to these UN meetings and using their one vote to not support even a humanitarian ceasefire that would only last a few days, that doesn't actually do anything for the Palestinians?
Agree. But in any way, how politics works in America. And if they are not losing something, they don't want to move. And they move following interests. It's like that. We can change it. Otherwise, if I can change it, I don't want to send money to Israel or Ukraine, from my taxes.
So, did you say your name was Leo?
Leo, yes.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, Leo, we only have a couple of minutes left. I know you have more questions. Do you mind if I ask if there are other questions in the audience?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, would anyone else like to ask a question of our panel or offer a comment? Okay, so I think we have time for one more if you have another
one. One I want to talk about is against you were talking about how you've co-written an article about the imbalance of the civilian death in Palestine currently. One of the questions I wrote is actually kind of on that subject, so I'm kind of asking you, but I'm asking the whole panel. The U.S. has previously and much more successfully taken down terrorist organizations without such massive loss of life. Why is using illegal firearms to terrorize civilians our best solution?
Yeah, I think that this question is about, the strategy the Israeli military under the current Israeli government is using. And many U.S. officials disagree, and behind closed doors are urging the Netanyahu government to take a different approach. The problem is, I think, Moises was mentioning from his research, the U.S. is also kind of limited in what it will do and say to impact Israeli change, because the Netanyahu government has already shown
spending $17.6 billion, which was just the most recent money sent to Israel to fund these weapons, including white phosphorus bombs, which are internationally illegal.
Yes, I mean, I'm not disagreeing. I think, but if the question is about the Biden administration is focused on winning the 2024 election. And so the Biden administration is trying to walk this fine line between liberal members of the Democratic coalition who are raising these points right now that you're raising and saying that it needs to be a much harsher response. By the way, I want to go back to Hernan's point that there isn't much change in foreign policy with the change in administration. Sometimes that's really true in this conflict. President Trump did this thing where he reversed decades of policy where at least the U.S. government said Israeli settlement building was illegal, and then President Trump reversed that and said, we no longer consider it illegal. And Biden only recently, because of the conflict and the pushback, said, oh, actually, let's revisit that it's, once again, it should be illegal to build settlements on Palestinian land. So yeah, the Biden administration hasn't wanted to touch this. So this is where it would connect for public opinion, as Hernan was saying. If it goes beyond just a few people, if more people are educated and become passionate about the topic, then I think that's where there would really be the change trickle. You're right, AIPAC is absolutely one of the most powerful lobbying groups. In some cases, the NRA has taken strategies from AIPAC, but AIPAC will be limited if the numbers keep shifting in how voters feel in local elections and state elections, and they're pressuring senators and things like that, that then their hands will become more and more tied. So step one would be education for people to know about the issues, and then step two would be, feeling like they care, feeling that there are a couple really passionate people here. So again, whatever your view is, I always respect just that people care and are passionate, because most people will just go eat dinner and never think of it again. So I always just respect when there's passion over this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So unfortunately, we're at the end of the time for our formal panel. So please join me in thanking our panelists for their wonderful presentations. And for those of you who are, thank you all for joining us. Thank you for those of you who are online for joining us as well. For those of you who are in person, we do have some space in the Studio One venue, which is just out these doors and to the left. You're welcome to join us for some further conversation and questions until, I think we have until 7:15, is that right? So about 25 minutes or so if you'd like to hang around and talk with our panelists. Thank you all very much. I hope you have a wonderful evening.